The British Army, the thin red line of unbowed, unbent, and unbroken redcoats who would pitch up to a battlefield, cheer huzzah for Old Nosey, their commander, the Duke of Wellington, as he rode past, and meet the grizzled veterans of Napoleonic France with a stern insult, a volley, and a bayonet charge. Or rather, that's the popular perception, based no doubt on the novels of Bernard Cornwell. The reality, perhaps unsurprisingly for those who don't take sharp at face value, is much more complex, more fragile, and more human. The British Army was a flawed force, struggling to adapt to a new strategic reality whilst also trying to pivot from an ancien regime setup to a more professionalised body. A transition that would take half a century, if not more. So, what were the challenges facing King George's men? How were those problems being tackled? And was it really functioning all that effectively? Tonight, we invite you to join us on a deep dive into how the British Army functioned as esteemed expert on the British Armed Forces of the Napoleonic era, Dr. Kevin Linch, makes his Napoleonic Wars pod debut. We talk about how the army operated, how it was formulated, and the efforts that were underway to reform it as we lay the foundations for a sequence of episodes that will enable you to get to know this much exalted and highly mythologized force. This is the British Army of the Napoleonic Wars. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, your stand-in, temporary, full-time, part-time quartermaster and host for today, Liam Telfer. And as always on this show, all the episodes that we produce are clearly professional and extremely interesting. But this is, if there was any episode that was ever going to be right up my street, this is one of them. Of course, as ever, I'm joined by Share Emperor, the Valiant Stormer himself, the Wing Commander, Dr. Zach White. How are you, Zach?
I am well. Thank you for sidestepping the fact that it's taken us 3 takes to get through the quote unquote sexy intro that we started with that. Our guest did comment that the veneer is slipping, shall we say, or the veneer of professionalism is a myth as esteemed and exalted as the reputation of the red coat. No, it's not. No, it's not, even by my standards. Even our guest is going, nah, you can't pull that off.
No. As you heard in the hopefully edited version of the sexy intro, today we have Kevin Linch. He's an associate professor of modern history at the University of Leeds. He specializes in the history of Britain in the 18th and early 19th centuries, focusing on the history of Britain's armed forces and their relationship to wider political, social, and cultural trends. He is the author of the recently published The British Army 1783 to 1815, which is available through Pen and Sword, and Britain and Wellington's Army. Working with Dr. Simon Quinn, he has also recently launched an online database of British Army officers available at georgianarmyofficers.org. And as always, we will put all the links to Kevin's work in the show notes. How are you, Kevin?
Hello, thank you. I'm well, thanks.
Well, like I said at the start there, I am so excited. I wouldn't like to sort of put the emphasis too much on the British Army in my research, but it's where, but it's certainly where I started my Napoleonic journey. So yeah, like I said, this couldn't be any more up my street if it tried. Huge topic to cover, and potential series, as it were. So I'd like to just jump right in, if that's okay. And starting with the numbers, an army is everything in its numbers, and being the quartermaster, numbers are my jam. So how big is this force? Because its size isn't constant. It's sort of forced for various reasons, which I'm sure we'll cover, to expand and contract. Can you talk us through that process and the motivations behind it and the impact it has on the army's effectiveness?
Yeah, just to sort of roughly outline the size. it's a kind of wave, if you like. It starts around about 50,000 in the 1780s, so before the war with revolutionary France, and then very quickly expands over to three times the size of that, up to about 175,000. Within 3 years, by 1795, it's quite staggering, and something we'll probably talk about how they managed that, or didn't manage that, might be a better way of putting it. Um, then there's a bit of a dip, which kind of seems surprising during a war that it actually go down a bit, but we'll come back to that again. Then it picks up again to up towards 1800, particularly kind of leading up to the campaign in Egypt. Then there's another little dip, so another kind of part of this wave sort of cycle in the Peace of Amiens, 1802 to 1803. Then from then on, it's fairly steady expansion through the early part of the Napoleonic Wars, right up to 1813, when it's about 310,000 men in the army by that stage. And then it starts reducing in 1814 and cut back through 1815 too. So there is this sort of cycle to it of it kind of growth and then cutbacks and growth and cutbacks. You're asking about why that is, why that would be the case. Oh, we could have a long discussion about that is. Um, and the basic answer, one of them, is that it's money. It's actually about how much not just the British state can afford, but how much political support there is to actually put that money there for it. I mean, this is not a new story in the history of the British Army. It's the same story for the following 200 years, right up to the current day, about how much can we afford and how much is the British state willing to actually pay for it. Um, so money is there, politics is there as well. About how much political capital a government might have to be able to actually, get the budget that it wants for the army. And at certain moments, that's quite tricky. Which is one of the reasons why the army is so relatively, certainly for European standards, small in the 1780s, is there's such a pressure on the government to cut spending, keep spending down after the American War of Independence. And one of the few ways they can do that is with the armed forces. Um, how this is all sort of managed in big terms is that every year in Parliament, a budget is voted for the army. The army estimates are presented, they're debated, and if they're passed, that sort of sets the size of the army for the following year. So there is this process going on all the way through the years. Every year, the government of the day has to get this stuff through Parliament. And so some of that is financial, some of it is political sometimes because of that. There are moments when they're thinking, we need to make this bill as easy as we can to get through Parliament. So we'll cut back a bit. Um, hmm, that was kind of part one of that answer.
I mean, you've made a rookie mistake that all newbies to this podcast do, which is you pause for breath, which then immediately opens the floodgates for us to.
Yeah, just kind of you
Um,
jump in and kind of, yeah, so go on then, go on. What,
yeah.
hit me with kind of, obscure technicalities about the army estimates that
I mean, so many directions we can go
Mm,
in on this one. The first thing I'm just going to talk about is to sort of pick up on that thread about how this is nothing new.
mm,
Britain, concerns about large standing armies. It feels a little bit sort of almost too easy to draw a direct line back to the English Civil War,
yeah.
concerns about the king, concerns about a resurgent sort of autocratic, divine right of king style of monarchy.
Mm,
We're well on the way in terms of constitutional ish ism, which is a whole process as well
mhm,
as a technical term. Um, that will continue for another century, right? But how much of an anathema towards large standing armies is there still? Because the concern about Catholicism, which finds its roots, frankly, in the Tudor period,
yeah.
hasn't gone anywhere. We
Mm,
know that because we know the Catholic Emancipation Bill is still years into the future.
mm, Yeah.
So has society, have politicians kind of moved on from this idea of we don't want a large homegrown body of bored soldiers sitting in the islands where they can make trouble and be potentially used to suppress the will of the inverted commas people, in as
Yeah.
much as Parliament really represents the will of the people, but that's another three
Yeah.
podcast series in its own right.
Yeah.
um
Let's park that for a bit. Yeah.
yeah. How much of that is a problem? And I guess also there's the Jeremy Black kind of line of argument, right? That Britain's army is fundamentally there so that if there's a war, they all get shipped overseas, go and grab some
Mm.
sugar islands, and then we use them as a negotiating tactic. How much of that is at play? Now, all of that is
Mm.
basically a comment rather than a question, but have at it and make of it
How
what you
about it?
will.
Yeah. Yeah. Anti-armyism, if you like. Yeah. I think perhaps what it was something that politicians, particularly in government, I get the sense were afraid that it could be used against them. So it wasn't necessarily it was a massively live issue all the time. But if someone in Parliament, the opposition in Parliament or a disgruntled MP wanted to cause trouble, it was a very easy lever to pull to just embarrass the government and to drag all this stuff out about, as you mentioned, anti-Catholicism, the standing army, oh, you're making new Cromwells, all of these sorts of things. That would chime very easily in a parliament and with MPs that were feeling a bit disgruntled about the government. Um, Behind or kind of behind beyond that, whichever way you want to look at it, I think there was a sense, a realization that, yeah, we do actually need an army and it does need to be quite good. And actually, once the French Revolution gets going and conscription gets going, it's going to need to be bigger than we've ever had before. And we need to do that. And one of the interesting things about the army estimates and Parliament is, and the sort of fear of monarchical control of the army, I think is Parliament getting much more control over the armed forces and wanting to know much more about not just the budget, but actually how many soldiers have we got? Have we paid what we've got? What we paid for? Um, where are they? Where are they being stationed? And parliamentary inquiries too, when things go wrong. It's kind of, well, what happened? And Parliament and politicians um, bringing more of the control of the army into their sphere. And I think that's part of the way that it became accepted. That actually, if we're going to do it, we want to do it in a sort of, parliamentary way, a constitutional way. And that kind of makes sense. They're fighting a Napoleonic regime, which is a military dictatorship. So they're looking for a different way to kind of navigate that problem. And I think it's Parliament. And I did sit there and go through all the parliamentary papers to find out all the times it mentions the army, and it's staggering the amount of information Parliament just kept asking for. Tell me how many horses you've got, tell me how many men you've got. I want to see this information about how many people died in this campaign. Enormous kind of appetite for information about the armed forces, which wasn't quite the same in the mid 18th century. You can't find the kind of information that I managed to use in a lot of my work in the mid 18th century and earlier because Parliament wasn't asking for it. So it wasn't produced, wasn't created.
Well, congratulations for opening up an entire warren just in response to that first rabbit hole. Um, where to go with this? Okay, let's start with that thing about MPs just being able to raise this to sort of
Mm,
make life awkward for the government, and sort of start dropping these accusations in there. And there are two strands to what I'm thinking in response to that. One is, to what extent is that a really dumb comment, in the sense that look at what Napoleon needs in order to secure power in 1799.
mm.
He needs what? A regiment, maybe two. So, you can have a small standing army,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can have your army deployed around the world, but fundamentally, anybody who understands the business end of a barrel of a musket knows that you need
Yeah.
maybe a couple of thousand troops, and your army's
Yeah, you
never going to
don't
be
need
so
hundred
small.
thousands for a coup.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Mm,
my first reaction is, well, is that a dumb comment? And the obvious answer is that these aren't dumb people. So
mm,
therefore, what are they trying to tap into? And I wonder how much of this is sort of a part of an ongoing tit for tat exchange that sort of becomes part of the fabric of British politics, and how much of it is sort of trying to speak to something that the people, inverted commas, might recognize? And to what
Mm,
extent is this about populism would be the wrong word for it, but some sort of way of talking about armed forces and the way that the government works that folks who are reading the papers or reading out the papers to, assembled pubs and coffee houses and all the
yeah.
rest of it would all be able to sort of latch onto and identify with? Or is that
Mm.
reading too much into the whole process entirely?
No, I don't think you are. I think there is definitely an element of kind of tit for tat in there and kind of parliamentary games, if you like, that particularly between Fox and Pitt sometimes, and particularly with Fox, you think, yeah, he's not actually really caring about this particular unit of. There was one case where they created a unit of military artificers, kind of, military tradespeople, and put them under martial law. And he raised this as an enormous kind of, affront to English liberties and these sorts of things in the Constitution. I don't think he was really that bothered about the 100 odd people that it was affecting. It was just to, you know, kind of cause a ruckus really in Parliament and just kind of prod Pitt about it. So I think there is definitely that element to it. There's a kind of sort of bubble there that they're living in, and they're, needling each other about things. Not necessarily populism, but I think there is a radicalism angle to this. That for some people, actually, the size of the armed forces was a really important issue and did speak to some people outside Parliament that this was evidence of potentially trying to suppress, you know, radicalism in Britain, and it was used to do that. And this being, a big increase because of the size we talked about earlier in the coercive force of the state. And although Jeremy Black's argument is that they, went off and kind of steal islands, for most of the wars, the majority of the army was actually in Britain and Ireland. Um, it's rare that it would get below 50%. So you're seeing parts of the country, particularly the southeast and the south coast, with enormous garrisons in them. Small towns that might have had a few hundred people, a few thousand people will then see 1,000 soldiers turn up and be placed in new barracks that have just been built on the outskirts of the town. And so for some people, this was quite a big and significant change, not just in their lives, but in their political outlook, what is kind of going on here, why they're here. And some of it probably was actually, yeah, they are here to defend us from the French and all those sorts of things. But particularly in the early stages of the wars, I think those who had more sympathy with more kinship with some of the ideas of the French Revolution would be looking at that and thinking, this is not, I don't agree with this politically. Um, Napoleonic Wars is a bit different, I think, by that stage, if not because everyone's probably got used to it, and it's kind of more obvious what they're fighting. I think 1790s is a difficult moment, I think, for politicians and those in the government running the sort of whole system about how they do this. Expand the army, recognizing that there are some people who are quite radical in their views in Britain about whether he should even be fighting this war, and managing that. Mm.
Is there a long shadow of the American Revolution in there? I'm very sorry, Liam. Liam is just there
No,
busting
no,
and
yeah,
seething at the fact that I'm hogging the mic. But hey, it's my
yeah.
podcast, and I'll be a Bonapartist dictator if I want to. Uh, I'll let you in after this one, I promise. Even though I've got like 12 more questions just on this point. Uh,
Mm.
but is just staying with that point? Is there a long shadow of the American Revolution
Yeah.
in
Well, I
in
mean,
there somewhere?
first of all, it's not that long, really, is it?
Well, true.
Kind of, 1793 when the war broke, it's only 10 years ago. For a lot of people in, government MPs and, the population, this is easily within their memories of what happened. And that, for some people, quite a lot of people in the country, was a civil war. Fought in a different part of the world, but there were, people who were pro what the American colonists were standing for in some way about resistance to tyranny and these sorts of things. There's a whole other series about whether they actually were, but but their perspective was, why are we doing this sort of thing? So there is that sort of certainly that sort of strand of kind of thought still in Britain in the 1790s that that's not how they want British polity to work. And the social order to work. For some of them, it's because they don't want the government intervening. It should be that they should be the leaders, locally, and they should be the ones sorting out these problems and have the authority to deal with popular disturbances and things rather than the government. But yeah, I think there is that unease about how to do this sort of thing. How to fight wars and why you're fighting them is definitely there. Yeah.
Speaking of fears of spreading revolutions and discontent,
Mm.
if I don't allow Liam a word in edgeways
We're
at
gonna
this
have we're
stage,
gonna have some
there will be a
popular
rift.
radicalism. Yeah.
Indeed, and let's be honest, Liam is well equipped with muskets and horses
Yeah,
and
well, this is
various
what they were
things.
afraid of. Yeah.
Exactly. So at this point, I will allow Liam to speak in a most magnanimous way.
Well, I'm going to leave you in your rabbit hole, Zach, and you can, feel free to continue digging there later. But I just wanted to go back and talk about the sort of political games and the sort of establishment of the establishment, as it were. How much sway do the military hierarchy at the time, your commander in chiefs,
Yeah.
people at that level, have with the budget setting and the establishment of the force projection? I mean, the army is a political tool to
Mm.
be to sort of inflict policy on other
Yeah.
nations, as it were.
Yeah.
And I'm certain the army would be saying, "Give us money, give us resources," whereas the government has to balance that. Now,
Mm.
how much sway do the army have in their own, I suppose, financial management? But I guess also you could look at it from a deployment perspective.
Mm. Yeah. And this kind of changes, I think, that in the earlier period, so the 1780s, 1790s, well, in the 1780s, there isn't a commander in chief. There is kind of no sort of representation of the army except the Master General of the Board of Ordnance, who has a very particular perspective, and he's the only one who sits in cabinet. So actually, the sort of army's influence in a direct way over those sorts of decisions about, how many soldiers and where are they going is quite limited. Um, where that starts to change in the sort of 1800s, particularly, is quite subtle in that it it kind of recognizes it doesn't really have kind of any way of being involved in the decision making at the top level. So with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary, then they're not really going to sit down and decide these things together. But what they can do is sort of feed them information that will help get the decisions that they might want, and start becoming much more organized about writing reports that are then going to ministers. Kind of, here's my summary of the situation and what I think we should be doing, and here's the forces that we have available to do it. And then sometimes kind of that becomes prompts of, we need an extra 10,000 men if we're going to do this. So that's what you need to be thinking about. That certainly really comes in from probably Castlereagh's time as Secretary of War. So from 1805 onwards, and then the series of people who follow him, really, there's much more sense of him working, not necessarily quite in partnership, but kind of listening much more to the commander in chief, and particularly the adjutant general, them being able to give them information and them kind of coming up with a plan, if you like, or an idea of things, which then can then take into cabinet and go, yeah, this is the best we can do, and we've talked to all the people about it, and so basically it gets nodded through most times. But yeah, that kind of sort of emerged through the period quite early on, and this is why I think there's so many problems in the 1790s. There is this really poor communication between those who are running the armed forces and those who are making the decisions about what to do with it. and just not really understanding each other and not talking that well to each other either. I mean, it's, again, this is not a new story about government departments not talking to each other, really, is it? But yeah, but it definitely gets a little bit better. But there is a sort of like the sort of the MPs and things we were talking about earlier, and fears of monarchical control. There is definitely a sort of slightly subservient relationship in this, that the army is providing information, the commander in chief is providing information, and someone else is making the decisions on that, which are the politicians, and that probably helps navigate some of those worries about military dictatorships, and fears of coups. It's kind of, okay, you can provide us with the information, but the politicians are deciding what goes where and how much and when.
I mean, I think I would love to sort of follow that up with more of the financial impact on the size of the army. But I don't want to sort of rabbit hole too much, unless, Zach, you're happy to let me off the leash.
Do it, because I've got a whole series of. I mean, I am acutely aware that we are more than 30 minutes into this interview.
Question one.
We're on question one. Like, this is why I said at the start, folks, this is going to be a series in which we gradually build up. The original vision of this was we want to talk about, the people who make up the army. Like, we will get there in episode 27. So you go for it, mate, because I've got follow-ups on this as it is.
So in terms of those numbers and that sort of financial impact we discussed in the last question and earlier on, is there any feeling within the government and the MPs, the civilian side of it, as it were, that a smaller army can be more effective than a larger army, if that makes sense? I guess prior to the sort of like the conscription, the levy en masse, the numbers aren't to the scales that we see, that progress through the wars. And I'm sort of looking at this from kind of a modern context, modern, it's a higher tier, smaller numbers, using technology in a more effective way. Is the government trying to do that in this period, or is it, let's get muskets in the hands of as many people as possible?
I don't think they had anything that sophisticated early on. I think with the French levy en masse in particular, in those early sorts of phases of the French Revolutionary Wars, were a real shock about just how many troops a country could raise and just how it could keep fighting, and threatened that idea that actually it was about the quality. You need to invest in the army and train them, for enormous amounts of training to go into to perfect all the drill and tactics that they need, and then they are such a superior force. It really challenged that. I think the government got a bit, more than a bit, got actually quite subtly better at it by recognizing that they could have different tiers of armed forces. Because although we're talking about the British Army here, it was not the only military force that the British state raised. And I think got much more savvy about thinking about what bits are used where. So they have the militia, that's somewhere between 40 and then later on up to 120,000. It's kind of, okay, these are pretty highly trained soldiers. We'll use those for home defense, but as in kind of defense of Britain and Ireland, because there is always going to be this fear that somehow an invasion could happen, and if it did, it could be catastrophic. So they can't take the risk. So they stay there. They also end up using those to feed the army, the British Army, which is the sort of sharp end that then goes off and does the fighting overseas. Behind the militia, then there are the kind of all the volunteers and the part-time soldiers. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of extra troops there. And financially as well, they're quite cheap to run. In the 1790s, most of them are paying for themselves. And then later on in the wars, they get a day's 20 days pay, for the 20 days training that they do. And these are seen as almost like the ultimate reserve that, okay, if the French do land with 200,000 people on the south coast, we can probably find 300, 400,000 people to try and defend against that. And there's this go way off topic now. There's this wonderful map in National Records of Scotland of, oh, I forget who it was by. It was one of the quartermaster generals at the time, actually planning the route to get everyone from certainly England and bits of Scotland to London within a couple of weeks. It's all mapped out. It's like a railway timetable. It's kind of this unit will turn up here and they will assemble there, and then they'll get in carts and be transported to this town. And it's an enormous piece of kind of, like this is a quartermaster military planning, but it was never used, kind of had it all there, never got used, put it away, and it goes into the archive, sits there for 200 years. So I think they got better at, sort of thinking, yeah, we can have a really highly trained part and we'll use that for the overseas operations. And then we'll kind of, have it's almost like reserve forces behind that, tiers behind that, doing all these other duties. And they replicate that wherever the British Army goes. So they do it in Canada, in North America. They do it a bit certainly do it in the Caribbean with some kind of local militias and these sorts of things. There's this kind of model of, okay, this is how we are, dealing with this change in the scale of warfare. They are not going to put 1 million men into the British Army, but they can find 1 million men in different combinations of armed forces. Maybe not 1 million, but the scale of it they can do in different ways. And that's how they kind of handle it.
So we were talking about the threat of, yes, yeah, I've just wrenched the microphone out of Liam's hand at this point. Don't worry, you can have it back in a minute. Just go and find a sword and threaten me, and then you'll get the microphone. It's that simple. But that kind of threat of force is where I want to go with this follow up, actually, because there are two ways of looking at this problem. One is that if you have too big a standing army, there is a threat of authoritarian use of force to wipe away parliament. But at the same time, if you go and teach all of this inverted commas lower orders of society how to use a musket and give them military training and then release them out into the world, suddenly they have the potential to be an organized body and can usurp the system.
This
how
is
do they
the ultimate kind of paradox of the
exactly
Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolutionary Wars. It's how do you mass mobilize and give kind of arms to people you wouldn't normally give with under sort of certainly less kind of control than you would do, and then stop and keep control of that to fight against a force or an ideas forces which ostensibly is there to try and liberate these people. Oh, that's what they're portraying. Yeah. Well, the short answer is with difficulty. Yeah. And the other one is kind of almost with not necessarily luck, but kind of, I don't know how to quite phrase it. There's a sense they kind of had to do something and they just had to trust that it would be okay. And for some people were quite positive about that. That actually, if we do put the arms in the hands of all these people, and we can do a bit to kind of instill some kind of patriotic spirit in these things, or we can build stronger senses of what they are fighting for, and that does get into the propaganda against the French Revolution, which often is not against the ideas, it's against what the French army is going to do when it turns up, what it's going to do to your children, what it's going to do to your women, what it's going to do to your property, what's it going to do to and playing on those fears, and kind of toning down in some ways the sort of the overtly nationalistic potential aspects of being in the armed forces. That actually you're doing your duty to protect hearth and home, particularly if you're in the part-time forces, or your locality, or protecting your friends or your job or your community, over and above kind of kind of some sense of kind of British national identity or British loyalty. They often kind of play on the sort of sympathy for the king. Actually, there is a monarchical kind of trait to it, but that can be quite apolitical sometimes. Certainly in the context of sort of the British political system at the time, it's not kind of Whig or it's not Tory or these sorts of things. Everyone kind of broadly agrees that the king should still be there, and at least before they get into the prince into the regency, the prince regent, that the royal family are kind of okay. they're worth people sort of they're the family that they can aspire to in certain ways or kind of look up to. But yeah, it's really interesting about, and it's not just Britain that goes through, all the sort of European states have this challenge of how do you mass mobilize and not cause a revolution, or not, not provide the mechanisms for a revolution. And of course,
Um,
one does happen, which is in Ireland. So yeah, that's not to say that it doesn't happen. Yeah.
I think that's fascinating to think about the political system, particularly in Ireland,
Mhm.
because during this period we obviously see the rebellion in 1798, right?
Mhm.
How does that affect the system in place in Ireland, and then does that have a knock-on effect for other colonies? You talked about these layers of the standing British Army, militia, fencibles, yeomanry, things like that. How does the rebellion in Ireland then affect that system going
Mm,
forward?
yeah. Well, in the first place, it actually becomes the first time that this sort of system actually gets tested. Not only are they facing a rising in Ireland, there's also a French invasion too, and they do mix together. The British Army that kind of fights that is this combination of the regular British Army, if you like, as you mentioned, fencible units and militia units, Irish militia units, and some of the part-time soldiers that were raised in Ireland. So it becomes an example of how this works, and it does sort of prove that it can. Um, the kind of ramifications of what that did. I mean, it means that they do sort of move this kind of model to elsewhere and think this is viable. It kind of then emphasizes the importance of the British Army generals being in overall charge of all forces in a particular area, and having the power and the authority to order sometimes some of these part-time soldiers or the militia regiments to go and do certain things. So one of the things that does appear after that, certainly in sort of 1800 through 1803 and 1805, with the big sort of second wave of French invasion threats, are military regional commands being established and generals in a particular area, not only looking after the units that they had from the British Army, the regiments of foot, artillery, cavalry, but then also being in charge of any of the militia regiments there and having the authority, if an invasion occurred, to then take authority over any kind of part-time units as well. So it establishes a kind of unity of command, in particular areas, which I think is really important, though so it doesn't really get tested except in Canada. The other big thing for Ireland, is, of course, the Act of Union, and if you like, the sort of the forging of a much wider United Kingdom rather than Britain and Ireland, a creation of well, at least ostensibly, a single state. And one of the things for that militarily means that um, units can move across the Irish Channel a lot easier. So Westminster, London gets more control over what units are in Ireland and what units aren't. And one of the sort of key moments of that doesn't come to 1811, so quite a long time after the Rising, is an Interchange Act which allows militia regiments from Britain, so England, Wales, and Scotland, to serve in Ireland and vice versa. And it kind of doesn't quite form a militia of the United Kingdom because they still had to technically, I think, volunteer for it, but there was a lot of pressure put on them to do it, and some incentives too. So you see kind of Ireland becoming much more central to Westminster's thoughts about defence. Not to say it wasn't before the Rising, they were aware of it, but I suppose they had more powers now to deal with it in a way. So if there was any kind of concerns about, a new French invasion could be happening, or there was, some domestic disturbances that they want to deal with, they could much more easily move troops from Britain to deal with it. And equally, if they thought some of the Irish units needed to move on, they could move them out of Ireland. If they thought some units had been in Ireland for too long, too long on the domestic duties, then they could move them out. So it kind of brings Ireland into this sort of system of moving units around, controlling it in different ways, and controlling it much more directly from Westminster.
So I'm going to see if we can set a new record for the longest amount of time we've gone before moving
Spend on
on
the
to,
first question.
yeah, but we're not moving on to question two anytime soon because I've got at least two follow-ups on this.
We've kind of gone quite a long way from where we started about numbers, though, haven't we? So
We have, but actually, I'm going to bring it back to Parliament and
yeah.
pick up on a thread that you talked about earlier, which was, I mean, there are two strands to this. One is the appetite for information,
Mm,
and I'm really curious about how that goes down because if you had
mm.
somebody like Wellington being asked for this kind of information,
Yes. Yeah.
you'd get a certain response, and it would be curt to say the least.
Yeah.
Um, the flip side is, of course, that so I'm used to reading up sort of these discussions around the army act, the Mutiny Act,
Mm,
through the context of military law, and so you get a lot of conversations about, well, I heard about this very specific case, and I want answers about whether or not this is sort of tyranny at play. And of course, Manor Sutton sort of turns around and goes, I'm not familiar with the context of that specific case. I will come back to you. And to his credit, he does then subsequently
yeah.
come back to you. So there is that
Mm,
indication that this is taken seriously.
mm,
So I guess my
mm,
first question is, what kind of reception does this get? And what is that process for getting these bits of information
mm.
back to MPs
Yeah.
when they raise these questions?
Yeah. Perhaps the easier one to start with is kind of, who's doing all of this work? Compiling all this information and getting it. So, because a parliamentary request that then goes to somewhere like the War Office or the Commander in Chief's office is a serious piece of business, I think, and they all recognise that this is not something that you can just put in the to-do pile and leave it for a couple of years and hope it will go away. Um, there is a kind of sense that, there will be trouble if they don't do this, I think. Um, but yeah, who's doing this? Um, and one of the answers, I suppose, is actually that the bureaucracy of the armed forces, the management of the armed forces, really, really grows, and partly because of this sort of stuff. Um, that there is a massive increase in the number of kind of clerks in these, working in these offices. It starts to feel a little bit more like a civil service. They're there as careers. Some of them have backgrounds, those are the few that we know about, have had some sort of training in this or some experience in this. So there's a kind of, professionalization of the bureaucracy, which is what Roger Knight does in his book brilliantly. Um, about kind of the state changing in this period quite gradually in some ways, not always kind of, really quickly, but really steady increase in the number of people doing this and the quality of the people who are doing it as well. I think also the sort of why they might have been okay with this is that they wanted to know too. That the army was interested in, actually, what is happening with the number of deaths and disease and desertion in the people that we have recruited. That actually some of the questions were things that they were interested in. So they weren't all that outlandish. Some of them were. Some of them were really kind of, really? Do you really need to know that? And I had to do a lot of digging for them. The reception bit. Yeah, as I say, I kind of got into that a little bit there. I think from the army, I think they start to recognise the value of it, and some way start anticipating some of the questions that could be asked. And so in that army estimates where we started right at the, is that nearly 40 minutes ago now? Started with the army estimates, they start including more information in that. So rather than just this is what we want, they start listing, this is what we've got. This is how many soldiers we have, and this is where they are, and this is how many deaths and desertions there have been each year. So I think there's a kind of sort of sense, I suppose, of some statistical mindedness, if you like, appearing in the armed forces, and that's not unique to the military. Actually, that's happening in the Treasury too. Is happening in other areas of government, and more broadly in um, political economy, political science. People who are at universities and thinking about how do we deal with the state? What does the state do? What should we be governing, and how do we think about governing? So it doesn't act in isolation, I think, in this. It's very much part of a wider trend of, yeah, leading towards Victorian senses of how you manage things.
And you talked earlier about sort of negotiations on army size.
Mm.
What does that look like? Because that must be a multi-layered thing, and you've alluded to this throughout the interview already. You've got the requests from horse guards,
Yeah.
which fundamentally are coming from all sources, including no doubt Wellington, who's going more men
More men.
now by
Yeah,
yesterday.
exactly.
Please and thank you. And why weren't they here 3 months before I submitted the request?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then you've also got obviously other theatres where there are surprisingly
Yeah,
enough other pressures and other commanders who go, "Look, I'd quite like some more
yeah, yeah.
people because there are
Mm,
never enough men to achieve
mm,
whatever you want for your campaign, right? Then of course the horse guards can send what they like to Downing Street, but Downing Street needs to look at the numbers. They've
mm,
then got to have a conversation with MPs of various persuasions and try and work out how they get this through
mm.
in an age where the whip is not kind
No,
of frankly a thing,
no, it's
just
not. Yeah,
period.
yeah.
So talk us through that, because that feels like a
Mm,
process and a half.
mm. I mean, at moments, and it's quite obvious at some moments, there is a real disconnect between what the military is saying and what it needs, and the government just goes off and makes some numbers up and presents them to Parliament, and then the army, in a way, has to deal with what it's got. Um, certainly in the 1790s, there's a real sense sometimes of, yeah, the government has no real idea about the scale of the forces it needs, um, and is focused on micromanaging certain aspects of it and these sorts of things, and then just tells the army to get on with it and kind of shrugs its shoulder a bit. As a sort of process develops later on, yeah, I think that a key um, kind of, well, it's a collection of people actually. It is the commander in chief, the Duke of York, and the adjutant general, and the military secretary of, I've got to get this right. Yeah, the military secretary of the Secretary for War, who are meeting up and discussing these kind of things in the 1810s, which is kind of, it feels like a two-way conversation, and the evidence for it isn't that great, but there's enough there to make you think, okay, they're doing this properly, if you like. Where the army is getting information from all its different theatres through the adjutant general, they are thinking a bit about where are the campaigns going to be next. What is Wellington asking for? But also, as you said, what's happening in South Asia, what's going on in Southeast Asia, we need to think about. Um, the army sometimes even writing reports about, actually, this is what, from a military perspective, this is what I think we need. Literally laying it out in 10,000 here, 20,000 there, and actually doing that work. Not always. But then there is that kind of, well, actually, this is kind of what I think we can afford and get through Parliament. And there's also the king to be involved in this as well. We shouldn't forget the monarchy, that, any suggestion they might cut back certain regiments might not go down very well. Um, yeah, the kings and colonels as well. So there is another element there they're having to be quite conscious of. I think part of the way they manage this is by incremental changes. So through the 18, sort of from 1806, 1807 onwards, right to 1813, it is a very steady increase year on year. And I think they can keep justifying that year on year. What if they went in 1803, 1804? Actually, we need an army of 310,000 by next year. I'm not sure how they do it. Is that part 20? We'll get to that. How they actually did it.
34, I
Yeah,
reckon,
sorry.
but yeah.
But yeah, that wouldn't have got through Parliament to sort of double the size of the army in a year. So kind of each year, if it's growing by 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, or if there's a particular year like 1813 or 1814, you can go to government and go, look, this, go to the MPs, sorry, this is probably going to be the last push. We just need to get this over the line. Some extraordinary legislation, just trust us for this one year. When we're going to be back again next year, so I'll talk about this again. They can, steer it in certain ways, present it in certain ways to get it through those discussions with Parliament. And actually, I think there's a character in there we haven't talked about at all, and that's Palmerston. He starts his career doing this work in the War Office. And there's probably quite a bit about his story after the wars about how much did he learn about managing political and the kind of strategic and practical and kind of managerial sides all at the same time and meshing those together. Mm.
See, that comment there about 1813-14 final push has just opened up a whole, not a rabbit hole, don't worry, but a whole kind of additional perspective on what I was talking about on the show recently about Wellington's Law on one of the exclusive episodes. Because one of the big head scratches for me has been, how does Wellington basically get through this bespoke piece of legislation on, I want court martials comprised of general court marshals comprised of 3 officers who answer only to me, punish immediately, and it basically it's fundamentally unconstitutional.
Yeah.
But it becomes constitutional because a bespoke act of parliament is passed to enable it into being. And actually, what you're saying there about, look, we're on the final. It's almost like not quite the downhill slope, but particularly
it's the kind of final sprint. They can see there, they can see an end point, even though they don't quite know how far away they are from it, but they can see that the end is getting closer. And that's the kind of some of the interesting things about the Parliament and the politicians and looking at all of this is that they could be quite flexible when they needed to be. And the sort of the ritual of some of the aspects of the military and the Parliament, like the Mutiny Act, like the Army, estimates, meant that yes, there is always an opportunity, at least twice a year, to talk about the armed forces, and an opportunity for MPs to pretty much in a way raise anything they want to about it. So it gives that sort of mechanism, that stability to deal with these things.
So this is an unfair question, not least because I promised Liam the chance to wrench the microphone out of my grasp. But how much of the mood is about success? If you think about what the Army's record looks like, 1790s, not particularly great. Early 1800s, not particularly great.
Yeah.
Send Wellington out to the peninsula and suddenly there's more of a discussion going on that takes a heck of a long time on, is this the right theatre to commit to? But ultimately, post 1812, everybody's just kind of clambering over one another to go huzzah for Wellington kind of thing. And how much of that feeds into this sort of shifting mood that you're talking about there?
Yeah, definitely. I think there is a political temperature, if you like, in Parliament about how they feel about the armed forces, and you can see that in the commentary on the army that is in parliamentary records like Hansard. So although you said the 1790s isn't great, sort of 93, 94, bits of it are going quite well in the Caribbean, but then when the Caribbean starts going badly wrong, and that's combined with the collapse in Flanders too, then that's when the army comes under more intense scrutiny. And it's no surprise then that actually the size of the army starts dropping, that actually they're having a tougher time of convincing people, we need even more soldiers, we need even more money, because MPs, well, what are you going to do with it, really? Where's it going to go? And you've shown that you've not been that great with it when you do have it. You didn't make great decisions with it. But then that shifts, particularly with the Egypt campaign, I think does a lot to sort of restore confidence. There is, some wobbles in the very early part of the Napoleonic Wars, and in some ways, actually, it goes the other way too. That also the political circumstances can affect the sort of the way the army is perceived and what the army gets. The instability that there was through those first well, almost literally up and probably until 1812 in British governments affected what the army got, I think, and on how much of a chance people were willing to take on giving it extra resources. Um, yeah, so there is this moment, I think, yeah, 1812, 1813, where, yeah, success is more obvious. The political system in some ways becomes a bit more stable, unlikely as it is that, the government that comes together in 1812 is going to be the one that's going to last way into the 1820s. Seems absurd to most people in 1812, but it does. Um, and that, does mean that those sort of, not necessarily, well, a bit slightly more risk taking is a bit more comfortable in Parliament, I think, than it was earlier.
I'd love to I'd love to sort of get into that kind of rebirth that I think the army goes
Mm.
through. I think, I mean, I never disagree with Zach ever because that's just sensible not to. But I think in
He's got
terms
his
of
mic
that,
on mute there whilst he's kind of, laughing
yeah,
heartily in the background.
I think the army does go through a bit of a sort of rebirth and almost an internal rebrand in that the turn of the century, like you say. I mean, at one point it's sort of wandering around the Med, and then thankfully someone decides to go to Egypt, and it kind of then I think that almost then sets the tone and shakes off some of the shackles of the American Revolution and the disasters in the Low Countries. Um, but I just wanted to go back a second, and I'm sorry, Kevin. Zach and I are sort of passing you back and forth on different threads, like some sort of extremely knowledgeable toy, but I can't resist. And I just wanted to look at. We talked earlier about the Act of Union,
Mm.
1801, and obviously it makes the establishment of the army easier to manage and more efficient in terms of being able to move troops back and forth. But from a sort of pathway grassroots perspective, does the Act of Union in 1801 change anything for pathways into the army or perceptions of the populace towards the army?
Mm.
Or does it not really change anything for the sort of prior kingdom of Ireland, as it were?
Um, it does in a way, in a bit that there was a distinct, not necessarily distinct Irish army, but there were units of the British army that were kept in Ireland and paid for by Ireland, and so did end up starting to have more of an affinity with Ireland. Um, and so that um, is kind of sort of structurally removed. But then it wasn't always that hard and fast anyway, that with sort of agreement, the Dublin government and London government could move units between each other and swap units over and these sorts of things. Um, so that it was kind of going on anyway. So yeah, possibly for those who are actually kind of joining up and enlisting in the rank and file, it's probably not too much difference really. Perhaps for the officers, it was a little bit different. That they may have felt, and certainly those that were on the Irish establishment in the 1780s could probably feel that they might have more control or more influence over what their working lives was like, because they were contacting Dublin, they were contacting the castle, they might have contacts there and these sorts of things, whilst probably most of the officers on the Irish establishment unlikely to have those kind of connections in Westminster. Some obviously did, but there's probably more of a sense of, the army in Ireland pre-union for officers being more integrated into the sort of political and social kind of, establishment of, the kingdom, and being part of their sort of world as, particularly sort of Anglo-Irish identity, Protestant Irish kind of identity, and this is what they stood for. So that kind of goes, I think, with the Union, because once they join the army after that as an officer from Ireland, then, well, you can go and be sent anywhere really, and Dublin doesn't have as much control over giving people leave, for example, than it would have done before, because they're not being paid for by the Irish Parliament because it doesn't exist anymore.
Mm.
So yeah, some changes, some not, I think. Yeah, it's an interesting question. We still probably need more work done on Ireland, I think, to be fair. and quite what was, what that what the differences were and what the similarities were between these two establishments. Because it kind of obviously still meant something, I think, because it's still significant, and they kept on to it. It wasn't kind of some, Tudor governance hangover sort of thing. It was actually quite, sensitive issue. It was a big part of the Act of Union about how they deal with all of these sorts of things, how they brought this about.
Andrew Dorman needs to be dragged kicking
He
and
does,
screaming
yeah.
into the Napoleonic era, doesn't he?
I'm quite well
Um,
standing in the wings, and I'm keep thinking, you're saying about me being the expert. There's other, more people more expert than I out there on some things, definitely.
See, I am very tempted to tug on that hook that Liam threw down earlier of the rebrand being in
Yes.
1801,
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a
isn't
big
it?
one. Yeah.
Shall we go down that one now?
I, I'm happy to. I'm
Okay, fine. Okay, so my counter argument to what Liam's saying, it's almost like I've got this kind of prepared. So
happy
you've got to think about where is the crossover point, because there is a transition. I think we're both agreed on that,
Yeah.
right? From a series of disappointing campaigns to
Mm,
actually this army is able to do something more impressive.
mm,
And you've got rumors of that with moments of decent work in the Caribbean.
yeah.
Absolutely, Egypt stands out as a notable
Mm,
success. Where are the other success points post 1801? You've got
mm,
India. That's
mm,
a whole question in and of itself.
mm,
And how much of that is down to the East India Company
yeah.
army fundamentally, and the sepoys working in conjunction with
Mm,
a British regular force. Copenhagen,
mm,
nobody's really saying that Copenhagen is a great testament to the glory of British feats of arms.
no.
Um,
Mm,
and the counter, of course, is you've got two screw ups
mm,
in 1809, Corunna and Walcheren.
mm,
And for all that you can turn around to me and go, well, yes, but Wellington, and yes, release of Vimero,
mm,
Oporto,
yeah.
Talavera, um, there isn't that obvious breakpoint, I would say, frankly, until 1812. And this is why I would argue
Mm,
that the rumblings continue, because what's the story of 1810 and 11? It's a
mm,
stalemate. Wellington on the
yeah.
defensive, focusing on the defense of Portugal, and then the
Mm,
re-liberation. So for me, it's not really until 1812 where you get Theodore Rodrigo, Badajoz, Salamanca in comparatively quick succession, that then the British Army can turn around and go, we have ascended to whatever it's seeking to
mm,
ascend to, and we can actually go comprehensively on the offensive,
mm.
not without challenges and problems and setbacks along the way. So I think the I don't think the goose is cooked in 1801,
No.
Liam.
Mate, well,
Happy to take the counters on that.
I it depends on what level you think about it, I think. This is my get out clause. And I'm going to get into some military history speak here, I think. Operationally, yes, you can't really say the British Army can kind of sustain a campaign against a major European kind of opponent like the French until 1812, 1813. Yeah, that's the moment where it is, yeah, this army is of sufficient size that it can contend with, and sufficient quality and sufficient kind of sophistication in its organization that it can do the kind of operations that France has been doing since the mid 1790s. Um, so yeah, there is that moment, but I think strategically, in the sense that the army can sustain um, influence, or kind of could go and do things, if you like, in a kind of in some sort of broad political sense of making things happen. It may even be a little bit earlier than 1801, I think. I mean, 1801 seems to be a big turning point, that it can deploy a force quite, strategically quite a long way away from, its home base, and have an significant influence over events. Um, and it can carry on doing that, because it's not just, thinking about you know, France and fighting in Europe, but thinking about all the other campaigns that are going on in, yeah, 1806 when they go and capture the Cape. You mentioned South Asia, but then there's also the war in Ceylon. Um, they even do some expeditions up the Persian Gulf in 1809, 1810, capturing the Caribbean. There's a sort of sustained force protection, I think. They're not always successful, but and that's sort of more about, I suppose, the sort of quality of the or the ability of the government and the army to do things at a strategic level has changed, I think, a bit earlier than its operational capabilities, have done. So it can do those kind of, well, we can go and capture an island, we can capture a colony, and we can do that really well by kind of 1809. But yeah, there's another level beyond that, I think. And there is a difference somewhere, I think, in the 1790s where they can do so. There is early Caribbean campaigns are brilliant, but it's kind of like then the army's spent, basically. It's kind of that's it. It's kind of ruined for 2 or 3 years as a result of that. Whilst, yeah, certainly from Egypt onwards, you can see this kind of pressure being applied in different parts of the world quite regularly, which I think is quite an impressive thing to be able to do. But it's very different from the Battle of Austerlitz or the Marengo campaign or something. It's a very different form of warfare.
It is, and we
Yeah,
risk. Go on, Liam. Go on.
I was just going to jump in and say, well, what he said to start with, Zach. I think you're right. It's the operational level catching up with the strategic level and that policy implication. I think there's always going to be a lag between the building blocks being put in and then the infliction of that coming to the pointy end. And I think you see that, like you say, the 1790s, we take an island in the Caribbean and the army is spent, deployed to the Low Countries, and it fails. And I mean, I think we could deep dive into why those campaigns in the Low Countries failed, and I don't necessarily think that was the British Army's responsibility as a whole. But I don't want to rabbit hole too far. And like I say, I think it's by the time 1812 comes, and they're still failures big. I mean, War of 1812 isn't great. But I think sum it up by saying it's the operational level catching up with the strategic policy.
Yeah, and I think that on the strategic level, I think governments and the high command of the army, I think those that were thinking about that realized in a way they just needed to stay in the war. That the British Army and certainly the British Navy in some ways could lose the war, kind of easier, if you like, that it could win it. There wasn't going to be some kind of knockout blow that the British Army could do that was going to mean, oh, okay, Napoleon's given up. They weren't going to land in there wasn't going to be a kind of D-Day moment where they're going to land in Normandy and march on Paris and it would all be over. It's just well beyond Britain's capability to do that in the end. So, Dundas thought about it and got some people to think about it, and that just, got very, very messy very quickly. Yeah, and I think from that kind of moment on, which was 1798, I think you asked about, there is a sense of kind of, well, what can we do? It's always like, what's the sustainable solution would be the kind of way you'd think about it now, rather than the kind of one that goes for the glory. And yeah, they well, in a way, Britain did win. They kind of did get it right. They got the strategic situation right and waited for the operational to catch up, rather than being operationally brilliant and strategically a disaster. It's quite an interesting tale about different ways of thinking of how to fight a war.
You said Normandy landings, march on Paris, and I think most of our listeners kind of went, okay, clearly you're one of the advisors to the plot for Ridley Scott's Napoleon II.
Yes, yeah.
Because it's been at least like a single episode since I last took a dig at that film. There is a kind of very broad kind of very, very theoretical question about whether or not there's a crossover there in terms of army effectiveness versus naval effectiveness linked into what Liam says with the War of 1812. But that is a debate episode to be had.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask something very unfair by way
Mm.
of wrapping up this episode, which hasn't got beyond question one at any point, even though, as you say, we have meandered all over the
Well, I think we
place.
kind of, having got this far, we may as well just stick on the first question, really,
That
haven't
was
we?
my
Yeah,
feeling as well.
yeah, yeah.
And that is India. Why don't
Mm,
people care about India? And for the context for this, for folks, the whole point about the Mutiny Act is that it contains the army estimates.
mm,
The estimates for the Indian army are held separately,
mm,
which there's a whole separate act. But fundamentally, the British don't care. They don't care about military law in India. That's
mm,
very clear. They don't review it for basically 50 to 60 odd years. When it comes to um, what's going on in India, you have got this problem, of course, that it is literally 18 months away. This is a thing
yeah,
we've talked about in the past. You send a letter, it
mm,
takes 9 months to get back to London, and the
yeah,
reply is going to take an additional 9 months to get back to wherever it might be.
mm,
So there is obviously that kind of very real
mm,
kind of strategic planning problem, which is that
mm,
you can't plan. You've got to delegate on the most monumental scale. But even so, nobody seems to really give much of a stuff about what happens in India. And part of me kind of goes, well, is the answer to this very obvious that there is an exploitative relationship going on there? And
mm,
part of me also goes, well, yes, but also there are huge concerns about what happens if there is a big riot or a big mutiny, as there are periodically.
mm,
And that completely destabilizes the new sort of center of British colonial
yeah.
thinking and efforts. So, what's your take on that?
Mm. Well, firstly, I kind of think there were definitely some who did care about India in the sense of kind of they were concerned about it. Care isn't quite the right word, I think, concerned, because the size of the force that was being sent to India, is quite remarkable in this kind of context of, hang on, we're, fighting this Napoleonic dictatorship and these sorts of things, or French revolutionaries. Um, but the army in India is almost always bigger than anywhere else in the world, the British Army component, and that's before as you have the East India Company Army to it as well. So they are prepared to invest in there really heavily and to keep troops in there. And as you say, part of that is sort of the strategic problems of distance that, yeah, you can't quickly reinforce it. But I think there also is just a general sense of this is really important and it's too important to, you know, Britain's economy, trade, banking, finance, all sorts of things that, as you said, there is this risk there that if anything happens, which is unfavourable to British interests and British esteem, the whole House of Cards might collapse. That this would be a big problem. So they are prepared to send a lot of troops there for that. But they, as you say, they do it in a way which kind of hides the fact that they are doing it from Parliament, and no one seems particularly that concerned about it. Um, though, there is some concerns about governor generals and what they're up to. I suppose another aspect about where they do concern is who they do choose as governor generals as well. The fact that they picked Cornwallis to go out there in the 1790s when and then brought it back to Ireland. But, they are choosing kind of people that they probably trust and probably think very highly of in their military and political and diplomatic abilities. Yeah. Um, kind of, what there's another kind of big what if kind of some of these commanders went to other places in the world. But some of the best commanders that Britain had, certainly at that level, strategic level, were in India, um, doing their work there. Hmm. But yeah, I think with the sort of broader sense of the campaigns there and what was happening, I tried to undo this in my book. Maybe I haven't done it very well. Was to sort of say, to try and put those back together because they have been a silo a bit. But there is a connection between all of them. And actually, I think the government gets better at recognizing those connections. And the army certainly thinking about how to reinforce India if there's problems, which is partly why they keep so many troops in South America. So not South America, South Africa at the Cape is it's almost like a strategic reserve for problems that are in South Asia, whether that be actually in the subcontinent or whether that be in Sri Lanka, or actually eventually we're looking at Southeast Asia as well. So there is yeah, it's not quite a parallel war, but it's kind of, there is another kind of conflict going on there, which is, and this is where I think it's interesting that I'm going on a lot, where I think the Horse Guards gets quite good is recognizing that Wellington is completely focused on Spain and Portugal and wherever he is, and he isn't thinking about the Caribbean, he isn't thinking about South Asia, he isn't thinking about North America at the same time. And they know that, and they're the ones doing that kind of, we could give him an extra 5,000 troops, but if that means less troops on the North American frontier, that's going to be a problem. If that means we lose the reserve that we have at the Cape of Good Hope, then what happens if there's a problem in South Asia? And they get these prompts, as you say, every now and then, of risings, rebellions, this war of brigands that often gets called, it's basically wars of occupation, almost constant resource and military force to kind of control the population, and it's continuous. But Wellington doesn't know that, which is kind of ironic because he's actually on the other side fighting that war against the French, and they're doing exactly the same thing in Spain and Portugal. But he's very focused on where he is.
There is a book in there somewhere about Wellington as a detrimental impact or detrimental force for wider British strategic efforts in the Napoleonic Wars. Kevin, we went for 78 minutes on question one. That is...
Is this a record?
Yeah, that is unquestionably a
record.
I
feel happy about that, I feel pleased about that.
We throw it down as a challenge to any prospective guests for the future, but we will call a halt there on question one. I'm not sure how many episodes this series will run for, but as we said, we had 14 initial questions with a provision for a second set of questions subsequently. So thank you for sticking with us for this one.
Hopefully, it's been great to chat.
Hopefully you'll be back for another. Folks, how do you thank Kevin for such a brilliant, wide-ranging and deep-diving interview, almost all of which had to come off the cuff because he prepped for an entirely different set of questions to the ones that we asked him. First up, you can go and get the British Army 1783 to 1815, which I believe was published with Pen and Sword.
Like Pen and Sword, yeah.
Pen and Sword. And then Britain and Wellington's Army was published with Palgrave Macmillan. You can also get his fantastic online database compiled with Simon Quinn on British Army officers. This is an incredible resource that, as a researcher, I just have that tab open when I'm writing about people, because you can just dive straight in and go, where was this person on this particular year? And already it's dug me out of hours worth of research that I would ordinarily have to do by just going, okay, that's the surname and that's the regiment. What was their first name? And it just enables you to add, even that little thing just enables you to add so much more color. But then, of course, it's very dangerous because then you start to dig into their careers. And go, okay,
so if you think this has been a research rabbit hole, which you start looking at that,
Exactly. It's a beautiful resource. Go to GeorgianArmyOfficers.org. We will put a link in the show notes so that you can access that. I would strongly, strongly recommend that you save it somewhere as a really useful resource to help you dive into the careers of these guys, because it's vast in its remit. And you need it, quite frankly. Kevin, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Hello again, folks. Please remember, we're still fighting back from that Spotify nightmare. So please do 2 really simple and quick things to help us rise from the ashes. First, whack that subscribe button, especially if you're listening to this on Spotify, because you're likely to have been disconnected. But whatever platform you listen to your podcasts on, please just do it anyway to make sure you can stay connected to us. Second, like and leave a comment. It helps bump us up the algorithm to reconnect with our lost audience. If you're a fan of the show, you can leave a 5-star review. Go on, you know you want to. And did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and all the hot gossip about what's coming soon? Because let's be honest, this show is all about the hot gossip. To sign up, go to www.thenapoleonicwars.net. Much love to all my Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording this in mid-August 2024, are in the mentioned and dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Mars Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schrager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals: John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Laird Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, Jason Morn, and the enigmatically named Zed. And I promise that's not just me boosting the numbers. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.